Welcome to Inside Scoop Live, the podcast where indie authors get personal, sharing insights about their books, their writing journeys, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt, and I invite you to join me for engaging conversations with both debut indie authors and seasoned veterans. Whether you're looking for your next great read or a bit of inspiration, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Stuart Goldstein joins us today to talk about his new book, The Vault. It's a gripping financial thriller exploring loyalty, betrayal, and the moral gray areas behind a daring heist in the heart of Wall Street. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Stuart Z. Goldstein is a former high-profile Wall Street PR executive with a decades-long career at institutions like DTCC and American Express. Now an award-winning author, he's known for his deeply personal memoir, Mo Fields, and his latest financial thriller, The Vault, which blends real-world events with compelling fiction. With a background in public affairs and a passion for storytelling, Goldstein brings both authenticity and heart to his work, drawing on his insider knowledge of the financial world to craft stories that are as emotionally resonant as they are suspenseful. Learn more about Stuart Goldstein and his work at stuartzgoldsteinbooks.com. Well, hi, Stuart. Welcome back to Inside Scoop Live.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about your new book, The Vault. Why don't you tell us all about it and what inspired the story as well?
Well, very few people really understand how the back office of the market trading environment works, and I thought it'd be an interesting subject for a story. The last time someone wrote a fiction book, it was Tom Clancy back in the 90s. He wrote about an attack by a foreign country on the computers to try and destabilize the trading markets. I thought I'd approach it a little bit differently, and this is a story about an attack from within. So essentially, employees who work at this company for many years have been disgruntled and mistreated over time, and so they come together and they decide to try and steal $100 million in bearer bonds from the largest securities vault in the world. And just as the action gets underway, Hurricane Sandy slams New York, flooding the vault, which potentially exposes the crime. So that's essentially the starting point for the story. And, the question of what happens, do they get the securities? Do they get away with the crime? Do they get caught? All these other factors come into play, and it's intended to make this story pretty much unpredictable until almost near the end of the book.
Okay. So you mentioned Hurricane Sandy, so you've woven in real world events. So you're adding a bit of historical information as well.
There's some history to it, but I think the idea of weaving in Sandy into the story, many folks, including financial journalists, don't really know. But in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, when it hit New York, it did indeed flood the largest securities vault in the world.
Oh,
That vault is responsible for $37 trillion in physical securities, money market instruments, bearer bonds, all of these things that are housed at that time in a central vault underground in the center of Manhattan, which was almost 2 football fields in size. So where does reality end and where does fiction begin? I thought that would be an interesting premise for a story because it borders on true events that occurred. And, I've slightly reimagined those events to make the story more interesting.
right. Well, they say the truth is stranger than fiction, right? How did that concept and your professional experience help shape the world that you created of AmeriClear?
Well, I essentially have always tried to explain what the company I worked for did in plain English. Most people don't know stock exchange, what happens after the trade, who takes that data from the computers and who matches up the trading information and who settles the money between the different trading institutions. That's all done by one company in the United States. Around the world, it may be done by many companies in different countries. But in the US, we have one single infrastructure for almost all trading activity in the financial markets, except for options. And so I think that that's a fascinating idea for people to get their heads around, and makes for an interesting subject for a story. I didn't focus so much on the technology and the trading aspect in the book, though I talk about that.
Mhm.
And I try and teach about that, if you will. But I focused on the vault, which ran, almost 3 city blocks below the streets of New York City, and where all the physical securities are held. And even though most instruments are kept electronically today, there still is a large, significant amount of securities that are physical.
Mm.
Bearer bonds, in particular, in the United States, they were outlawed in 1982. So, some of these bearer bonds, I mean, the genesis of bearer bonds go back to the Civil War. And whoever holds the piece of paper actually owns the instrument. So that makes for a very interesting dynamic, especially when the vault floods and the seawater potentially destroys the bearer bonds.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
As time has gone on, some of these certificates have been, are water safe, if you will. It's like the money you carry in your wallet. You can put it in the sink, you can put it in a washing machine. It'll still come out looking like money.
Oh, I
And
see. Yeah.
there's a lot of stock certificates that more modern pieces of paper, the technology has allowed for safeguarding some of that. But older instruments dating back, like bearer bonds, won't have some of those features, which is why it became the ideal instrument to talk about in this story, because A, they're easy to fungible to take and sell. A single bearer bond could be worth $1 million. So if these employees are stealing $100 million, you can do the math. It doesn't require you to take cartons and cartons and cartons. It's a small number of actual physical pieces of paper. How they get it out with all the cameras and stuff like that, that becomes part of the excitement of the story.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about a couple of your characters. Andy Russo. He's a morally complex figure. He's loyal, but increasingly disillusioned. What was your, I guess, approach to writing a character who kind of toes the line between hero and anti-hero?
Yeah, I think Andy is the central character. He was there from the beginning of when they created the vault. I mean, in decades past, you go back to the 70s and even before that, every firm used to have their own vault, but the industry essentially felt that by centralizing it, you didn't have these people who would be runners around Wall Street who'd be carrying certificates and losing certificates. Either they got lost or they got stolen. So
Mm.
the centralized vault where everything would be kept, and then electronic records would keep the firms informed about what their positions were and where the securities were held. They could get access to that. Andy was there at the beginning when they actually started to create the vault, and he's from a very modest background, and that's one of the things that's common to all the characters in the book. They're all immigrants, and they all come from different immigrant backgrounds. There are certain thematic things that are constant with these folks. They take pride in the work that they do. They come with strong values that they've inherited from their families, regardless of culture and ethnic backgrounds. And Andy epitomizes that as the leader of the vault. And he is the one guy who can move among all the people who work there with a degree of respect and loyalty that he shows to the employees, and conversely, they show to him. And so he's a reflection of his times. He's complex in the sense that he's always been loyal to his mission,
Hmm.
his pride in his life, his feelings for his wife, and so he's a family man. And he's a guy who doesn't have a lot of airs. He has an expertise and he's respected by people in senior management on the same basis that he's respected by the employees who work for him. So, there's that quality that he carries, but he doesn't have an ego. And I think that's one of the things that makes him relatable to both the employees who work for him and to the reader. As the readers read about him, he's a guy that everybody likes. He's just a likable fella.
Well, yeah, everybody likes the good guys. Now, you mentioned the diverse cast and certainly brings a different energy to the story. Why was that important to have this diverse cast?
Well, it was always going to be a story about people and people who work together. and people who come from different places, but in their time working together, they grow to respect and value each other. And I think that's, something certainly that I'm concerned is a little bit lacking as we look out into the larger society that we live in. So I was drawn to wanting to tell excuse the expression, a buddy story,
Mm.
a group of people who work together. But it's where I put a lot of emphasis. I spent an enormous amount of time doing research on each individual character. I mean, I was creating them as I wrote about them, but the ethnic backgrounds, the history of cultures that each person in the story brought to it. Edith Colon, one of the characters in the story, came from Puerto Rico. And, I found a fascinating story how Puerto Rico was our replacement for Pearl Harbor after the attack during World War II, and how the US government transformed the island into a place where they made armaments for the war, and where 65, 70,000 soldiers came from Puerto Rico. And I don't think that's widely known in the larger society. And it's fascinating, the sacrifices and contributions that Puerto Ricans made. And so that was part of Edith's background. And after the war, very few people could find jobs because we had changed it from an agrarian society to an industrialized society.
Mm.
And they didn't have other things to make after the war. There's no more weapons to make or ships to fix. And so there was
Right.
a period in Puerto Rico where it was hard to make a living. And there was something called the Great Migration. 20% of the island came to New York and to the United States in search of a better life. And Edith was the byproduct of that. And that's an example of how each character had some history and some background to it. There's another character in the story, Jenny Lee, whose family escaped communist China in the bottom of a boat. And, it's a rich insight into the struggles that people and the sacrifices people made trying to reach America and find a new opportunity for themselves and for their children. So each character has that kind of backstory. And that was where an enormous amount of time was spent doing research so that it would be true and people from those different ethnic communities could identify with characters in their own life experience. That was purposeful. That was part of what made the story whole and brought these folks to share a common set of values and bonds.
Yeah, I think the research can be so interesting. And, when I think of New York City, the first word that comes to my mind is diversity. New York is where people go when they want to come to the US for a better life.
I think what's fascinating in New York is you get insights because there's so many people in such a small space. And as you go out to the, different sectors of the country, certainly you're going to find places where people came from after the, Vietnam War. And so there's congregations of Vietnamese people, there are congregations of Japanese people. And so the richness of what it is our country has as a country is its diversity. Now, there's certainly some division right now in the country about some of that. Uh,
Hmm.
Hope will dissipate, and because I think one of the underlying themes, it's not the primary purpose of the book, but certainly one of the side themes of the book is, we're all in this together, and we learn and we benefit by respecting and valuing each other. So I hope that comes through in the book, but that's certainly a side theme. This is really about the theft of securities and if they get away with it.
Yeah. So the novel critiques the systemic bias and inequality in corporate America. How much of that was drawn from real observation versus creative storytelling? I imagine you have a lot of stories inside of you.
I think that there's one step forward and two steps back on any number of fronts, whether you're talking about, in the vault, in the 70s, there used to be a practice where, it wasn't a rule, but it was a practice. If you were white, you worked above street level. And if you were a minority or an ethnic, you worked below street level. And okay, that's a historical frame of reference. It's not to say that all of that exists today. Do some of those biases exist? Well, women are still trying to break through the glass ceiling on many fronts. In the financial sector, I think they've made some significant strides, but that doesn't mean in the marketing and advertising sector, the advertising business, it still has its male-dominated kind of industry. So I think as you look across sectors, drawing attention to systemic bias, because I think some people today think we shouldn't focus on those things and we shouldn't acknowledge those things. I don't think that moves us forward in any industry sector. I think how we deal with it and how we try and address it is important because everybody has something to contribute. So some of this is historical, but very relevant even to discussion today.
Right, right. How did you ensure that their experiences came across as authentic and multidimensional?
There are a multitude of characters. So in each case, you try to draw some contrast and highlight individualized examples of things that they may have experienced that underscore how bias creeps into practices that exist in companies. And I think that's the way it is. I don't think that there's one thing that happens. I think there's multiple things that occur. It's not the big slices, it's the small slices that over time cause injury to people and the way they perceive things. So, that's what the writing of a story, I think, is to try and weave it so it's subtle, but it's there. And over time, people can recognize it as they read about different characters and what they experienced. But again, that's part of the backdrop. That's, when people read the story and say, why would someone who's worked at a company for 20 years be motivated to do something that crosses the line? I mean, that's
Mm,
one of the fundamental questions that I struggled with in writing the story is how do you justify? We all, understand and we've all learned the difference between right and wrong, but what motivates people to step over that line? And, when do you go from being a robber to being Robin Hood? I think that was one of the issues that you deal with as you're writing the story to try and craft it in a way that has people wondering, what would you have done if you were one of these people?
yeah, yeah. You talk about the vault being a heist story, but also there's that undercurrent of the vault employees of rebellion and reckoning. So would you say it is more of a heist story or a justified resistance story or both?
I think it's both. One book reviewer, wrote a line that I enjoyed. They talked about the vault as being a story of loyalty, of betrayal, and of redemption.
Mm,
And the issue of redemption, probably could be looked at from a couple of perspectives. The perspective of the people who committed the crime. It could be from the Andy who sort of is looking at the situation almost from outside of, seeing what's been going on with these people over the years to his own personal views, but also the reader. Another reviewer had referred to it as a Robin Hood story on Wall Street.
mhm.
Uh, and that's kind of a historical reference to, at what point does crime seem justified? And, if indeed people are being mistreated. But I like the line that it's really a story about loyalty, people who inherently are loyal. And, even in the middle of the story, as the flood is coming to New York and to the vault, the employees who are actively engaged in the theft of the securities actually go back to work to try and safeguard the company in terms of its overall mission to protect the industry. That was purposeful in writing the story because it really underscored the sense of commitment that these people felt towards the company's mission, even though they felt they somewhat betrayed by the actions that the company took, which included layoffs, reducing their benefits, cutting their pensions, that even though they were hurt and they were upset, they still had a certain amount of pride that this company had a role to play in the industry to protect, investors, to protect the markets, and they could not let go of that, even in the midst of the idea that they were going to undertake this crime. So I think that's a very interesting, vantage point for people to read and to talk about and take away their own reactions to the story.
Yeah, yeah. But was that all planned, or did your characters kind of go in a direction that you didn't plan?
Well, I think that, when you're writing, you're trying to layer themes. And so there's some that you repeat and some that you create anew. So in the midst of writing, you may think of something to do with a character that adds to that telling of the underlying theme. Woven through the book is a concept about the golden rule, which I know my mother drilled into my siblings and I, that concept from the time we were young. And certainly it's one of the themes I've layered out through the book is whether or not we're treating each other in the way we want to be treated. So you develop characters along the way in a way to try and shape and add or subtract from that theme.
Right, right. So, any surprises that you can think of from your characters?
Well, in a sense, the author is kind of pulling the strings and shaping the reactions and the behavior. So you're not necessarily surprised, but you hope readers may be surprised either at how people act or how they respond. And, sometimes you create characters that bring out and reinforce your judgments about, right and wrong. So certainly the Dave Connolly CEO character is someone who seems, somewhat out of touch, someone who seems self-absorbed and is more focused on their own personal standing and status.
Hmm.
Not someone who necessarily goes down to the vault to meet the employees and really cares about people. And I think that there's some of that in corporate America. I don't want to say it's the pattern, throughout, but you do find different kinds of leaders bring different kinds of values. And those that can relate to people on front lines have an ability to inspire and incentivize behavior and performance. And those who are self-absorbed or care more about their own careers and less about the people around them, they're inclined to make mistakes and suffer consequences.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm curious about the way you manage to explain complex financial systems because when I hear finance, I mean, my head goes, How did you manage to explain it in terms that readers can enjoy the story without feeling overwhelmed with financial stuff? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think in particular, the workings of the infrastructure on Wall Street can seem highly complex. But as a writer, as a communicator, when I was working or now as I'm writing about it, there's a side of you that always wants to inform and educate so people are more empowered and they can feel, on the one hand, when you read the story, you can feel comfortable that we have one of the most secure, safest market infrastructures in the world. And certainly it's the most efficient and the cheapest in the world. And I really work overtime to try and highlight that. Your stories about 9/11, which I think really give people insights that they may not have ever had about both the threat to the system, because our trading markets didn't open, but that's not the thing that causes the London Stock Exchange to freeze up. What On 9/11, London stopped trading because they wanted to know whether or not payments would be made in the United States on trades that were executed 2 or 3 days before the attack. And
Mm,
so there's a part of me that, as a communicator, as a public relations spokesperson for the company, I was always trying to inform and educate in a way that people could walk away feeling that they got insight in terms of how the whole system works. We're all sort of curious whether it's financial services or it's neurosurgery. We all sort of fundamentally want to know in plain language, how do they do that? And
right.
and and do they have the skill and the knowledge to do it in a way that I can sleep at night? So there's part of me that in the story, that was a point of emphasis. Obviously, it's in the context of a larger story about, a group of people trying to steal securities. But, if there's an opportunity to, in plain English, help readers understand what actually goes on day to day. I mean, we're talking billions of trades that go on every day in the United States and seamlessly.
Yeah.
And our cost to do that is cheaper than any place in the world. So there's a degree of reassurance there in the way you explain it. And hopefully I've succeeded in that. I'll let readers decide, but that's the underlying purpose.
Okay. Okay. So, what kind of response have you had from readers, and what do you hope readers are left thinking about when they finish reading The Vault?
Well, there's been a very positive response so far, obviously. I've built into the story multiple plot twists. There's the primary story going on, but then there's side stories that come into play that have everything to do with whether or not the employees will be discovered. There's a security person who feels hell-bent on finding wrongdoing, even if there is no wrongdoing. So whether it's real or imagined, they're on a quest to uncover it. So there's a level of unpredictability in the story. One reader described it as kind of a roller coaster, and you don't really know it until the end of the book whether they've succeeded and whether or not they're going to get caught. And I think that adds a level of excitement. I mean, some readers have referred to it as a page turner. I'm happy to have all of that stuff.
Yeah.
No one has said it was boring, which is I think is probably critical for a thriller. But most of the feedback has been very encouraging and interesting. A set of comments that have come from several people is, what will the sequel be? There's a couple of people who've actually written me emails saying that, why don't you take a couple of the characters and continue telling us what happens to them after the end of the story?
Oh,
Uh, and that's sort of food for thought for me. If the book is truly successful and keeps going in the direction it's going, whether or not that's something I may want to consider doing, since readers are interested in it, does it make sense to try and build the story out a little bit more and dive into, two or three characters and talk more about what happens to them after this story concludes.
yeah. Yeah. What was it like? Your first book, Mo Fields, was nonfiction. What was what was it like moving from nonfiction to fiction? And what is your preference?
I think they're very different. The Mo Fields is a true story about my father and my parents during the Depression and trying to grow up through that period, going off to war and coming back, trying to start a business, and then, a life story of what happens to the children. So, that was very engaging. And I spent a number of years commuting on the train, writing in notebooks, preparing for that book. And, The Vault came to me actually in the middle of while I was working on the first book because
Hmm.
at the company where this second book takes place. So it was a fanciful idea. I wrote some notes down and I said, maybe I'll go back to it. And I did. And I'm glad I did because it was just fun writing it. I liked the people. I liked the story. I liked sort of the unpredictability of creating something where readers might be sitting saying, okay, what's going to happen to these folks? So I think that was satisfying. The first book is clearly a legacy opportunity for me as a writer, as a father. The first book is really about a story not just about my father, but about a story about parents and about all parents and the
Yeah.
things they do in our lives to try and leave us with something to guide us when they're not here. It's not the things they teach us, it's their behaviors. It's the things they do day to day that we take for granted, but after they're gone, become our legacy.
Hmm.
And I hope that you can pass it on to your own children. So that was the impetus for the first book. Second book is a roller coaster ride.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what is next for you? You've written a fiction book, you've written a nonfiction book. What's next for Stuart Goldstein?
I'm not certain yet. I think that the process of marketing and promoting a book today is quite time consuming and demanding, especially if, we're sort of in an age of celebrity. So if you're a politician, a rock star, a sports figure, you're going to get millions of dollars in advertising to promote your book.
Hmm.
But otherwise, you're on your own. So I think I need probably 6 months to finish navigating the promoting of this book, and then take a few weeks off to think a little bit about, okay, now what? I always have story ideas that I write down in a notebook in different directions that you can take. I also think about writing. My first love was writing newspaper bylined articles on public policy issues.
Mm,
My first career was in government and politics. There's still a lot of issues out there, not controversial issues, but just issues that don't get attention because they're not controversial, that I might enjoy going back and writing. And I'm not really focused on so much the partisan politics and the divisions that we currently see, but on substantive issues, healthcare, for example, the delay in payment, how long it takes doctors and hospitals to get paid,
mm.
maybe 60 to 90 days to get a payment. And part of that inefficiency is built into the system because the folks who make those payments benefit from not paying right away. So there's some interesting ideas to write about some of those substantive issues and how they might be addressed and changed. I will tell you the financial infrastructure in the United States and how we clear and settle trades that go through the financial markets is a wonderful role model for other industry sectors where payments are involved and where efficiencies are required. So, I may want to spend some time writing about something that's away from book writing, but we'll see. As a person who thinks about things, you sort of move between stuff, and one day to the next, you're not sure what motivations will overtake you. But certainly, I'm hoping to continue writing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of options too. So, well, Stuart, did you have anything else you wanted to add today?
Well, there was one question that you had asked me earlier. I just wanted to come back to it. It was having to do with parts of the vault that may have been emotionally difficult or meaningful to write about. And
Yeah.
I think in every story, there are moments where you struggle with some of the characters. In the vault, there are a couple of health scares that some of the employees experience, and I wrote about those. And anything that sort of comes close to your own life experience where you've had relatives or friends ill, it becomes a little sensitive, meaningful in the sense that when you write about it, it's cathartic and it helps you deal with the emotions. But I think the most challenging passage in the book, and it's funny, I'll ask people favorite sections of the book, but my favorite, even though it was very difficult to write, was probably when Andy Russo's wife passes away in the story. And, I tried to give people a sense of how much he cared about his wife, that when he discovers her, how he sits next to her bed and she's gone. And he has to come to terms with the fact that he's lost one person in his life that he cared about the most. And it was a very difficult thing to try and control emotions and to still capture what is the special thing that goes on between people in their life. So it was both satisfying at the end after it was done, but in the middle of the process, I think folks would be wrong to think that writers just can breeze through these things. They really have to search and relate to those things from their own life experience, having lost a loved one or known someone who's lost a loved one, and to do it justice, because you hope that the reader walks away having a deeper understanding of what motivates Andy Russo as a character in the story. And the most important influence in his life is the one person he met in grade school who he loved his entire life. So I just wanted to share that because sometimes, I don't know if readers realize that these things aren't just pulled out of the air. They really are built and created based on real things in our own lives.
Yeah, yeah. And it sounds like you inserted yourself into Andy's life in order to be able to write that authentically.
The thing that's satisfying and also most challenging is that when there's a character driven story like this, you almost have to change your hat each day as you're writing to embody the person that you're writing about. So it's almost like you have to become Andy Russo, or you have to become Edith Cologne, or you have to become Stella Jones, so that you can try and think about how that person might be feeling or how they might respond in order for all the characters to feel as if they're real to the reader. Because if you were just sort of drawing from imagination, I don't think it would come across as real, and I don't
Right.
think readers would value it as much. And I say that with an appropriate apology, because your background and your culture and your religion all shape you in ways that are unique to you. And so while a writer attempts to do what I've just described, it's not to say that you can fully achieve it, because it's hard to know how all those variables shape your reaction and shape your thinking. But certainly that's the goal, is to make it as real and as true to the person that you're writing about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you are successful in that area. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for joining me today, sharing with our listeners, new and returning listeners, a little bit about your story and yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope that folks will read The Vault. And I do have a website, and folks can send me notes through that website if they want to tell me their reaction, or have a favorite character they'd like me to write about. I'm certainly be curious to get feedback.
Okay. And can you give us your website address?
Yes, it's Stuart Z. Goldstein Books, BOOKS.com.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Stuart.
All right, be well.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Stuart Goldstein, author of The Vault. You can learn more about Stuart Goldstein and his work at stuartzgoldsteinbooks.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.